Kubernetes to me is a good example because according to that article, I could almost make a conclusion that there were no true success stories of using Kubernetes until now because it wasn't 7 years old, right? And that's absolutely not true.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 116, Why You Should Choose Boring Technology. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
I was recently listening to an episode of the Go Time podcast. Now, full disclosure, I am not a code programmer. I read about it, I watch things about it, but I'm not a Go programmer. But this podcast is pretty good because it usually goes on for an hour, hour and a half, and I get exposed to some certain ideas. But one of their features in the podcast is always unpopular opinion. And on a recent episode, 186, one of the unpopular opinions is that you should never use a technology that is less than 7 years old. And they base it on a blog post from Dan McKinley about choosing boring technology. That, surprisingly enough, came out almost 7 years ago now. What do you think, Victor? Should we use every bleeding edge technology that comes out?
To begin with, I think that 7 years old might not be what the author wanted to say, because almost all bleeding edge technology is 7 years old. I mean, if you look at the startup, some product that just kind of is gaining traction right now, that product is likely 7 years old, because it takes time from the conception of an idea, from the first line of code written until that line of code converts itself into a company, and then that company becomes a company you know of and things like that, right? But ignoring whether it's 7 years or 10 years or 5 years, I'm not sure I would agree with that. Actually, it really depends on what you as a company are trying to accomplish. If you want to beat competition, then you might want to go with bleeding edge. If you just want to consolidate what you have, then I think that the article is right. Simply, you cannot beat competition. You cannot beat somebody by using the same rules as that somebody, right?
Well, I don't know that I agree with that, but let's assume for a moment that I did. Why do you say that?
I mean, to be better than competition, you need to come up with something that competition doesn't have, right? And that's not necessarily, hey, they don't have a green button. All their buttons are red, so I'm going to beat them like that, right? It is by doing something that they're not doing. That's why Netflix is killing the market. Netflix is at the bleeding edge. Now, they're not at the bleeding edge with everything, right? Let's make that clear. They have all parts of the system like anybody else. But there's so much at the bleeding edge that they create the bleeding edge. So they're kind of one step in front of those using bleeding edge. They're creating it. One could argue that that's why they're ruling their market segment. And the same thing can be said for quite a few other companies.
I think what you just said there makes it not apply to what we're talking about. Because if you're creating it, if you are writing it from ground up, then you're not using technology. You are creating the technology. Now, you might be using some technology that may be newer to help create, but the end system is created.
Yeah, but I use it as an example because that's even more dangerous potentially, right? Because if you're creating it, then it was just born and you're the only user of that something. If you're using bleeding edge, not creating, then you're slightly safer because there are already few others that are using it as well, right? And making it safer and then testing it and what's not. So I used it not as to say that that's the same as using bleeding edge technology, but rather that it's more dangerous.
One of the statements that they made on that Go Time podcast also was one of the guy's bosses said, "I never want to be paged ever." And that is the reason why we are using not necessarily older technology, but stable technology. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's right. I think that person is completely correct and right. If that company needs to rely on other companies to tell them whether that something is stable, which is majority of companies, just to clarify, right? Now, you might have systems in place that will allow you to actually deduce whether making this change, it doesn't really matter even at this point whether that's a change to your code or change of technology, but whether making this change will potentially result in a PagerDuty call in the middle of the night, right? But that article, I think that I do agree. It's just that with that title or article in general, I'm just saying that vast majority, it makes sense for a vast majority of companies because vast majority of the companies do not have to be on the bleeding edge. And they don't have to be on the bleeding edge because they're not really competing with the rest of their industry segment by being better. Absolutely better.
Or being innovative.
Yeah, but innovation is kind of, you need to innovate to be absolutely better than anybody else. That's a necessity in this industry. I mean, that's a necessity in almost any industry. If you look at sport, for example, they're constantly top athletes, or at least clubs of top athletes are constantly innovating and finding better ways how to, get that extra second removed from your time, right? Innovation is everywhere, and in our industry, innovation is more dominant than in others. Fair enough. And that just makes it more of a case that innovation is important.
Let's bring out one of the real dates. The initial release date for Kubernetes was June 7th, 2014, at least according to Wikipedia.
Yes, that makes it just about
7 years old.
technology to adopt now. 7 years old, yes.
7 years. And we've really seen an upswing for Kubernetes over the past year, correct? Do you think,
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's been increasing over the past couple of years, but really this past year, how much of that can be attributed to the 7-year, or how much of it can be attributed to the CNCF landscape puzzle and everybody's just doing it now?
It's attributed to 7 years. I mean, not necessarily because of that article and 7 years being magical number, but as time passes, we have more and more people jumping into some technology. But Kubernetes to me is a good example because according to that article, I could almost make a conclusion that there were no true success stories of using Kubernetes until now because it wasn't 7 years old, right? And that's absolutely not true.
But for people that are working in companies, or let me rephrase that, for companies that have been risk averse to technology changes. I've recently, in the past 12 months, talked to people. It's like, well, we're still running everything .NET on bare metal because we don't even trust virtualization. That was a real conversation that I had. Those are the final 20% or the final 5%, I guess, of most companies. But as Kubernetes has grown, has matured, they're now out of their toddler phase and into their elementary phase.
Yeah, now it's wide adoption phase. Nobody can live without it phase, at least for Kubernetes. But at the end of the day, is it really about 7 years, or is it about you being or not being capable to deduce, discover through labs, experiments, what's or not, whether something is ready for you? I think that's the major question. Do you have the capacity to evaluate something? Or do you have to rely on others evaluating it for you? Now, if you're in the latter group, if you rely on others to evaluate something, then 7 years, give or take, makes perfect sense.
But how many people stay We joke about retiring all the time, but how many people really stay at a company for 7 years now?
Many people in the companies like the one you mentioned.
That's true. That's very true.
But there is also the thing about attracting talents, and we can probably have split into same two groups. Is that if you want to attract really top talent, you cannot put them on whatever was before VM's type of system, right? Because for his career, that's a very bad idea. That person is not going to accept job. I'm talking about top talent now, right? So there is that element as well. Kind of, hey, if you want to employ somebody who now is called DevOps or sysadmin, operations guy, SRE, and you say Kubernetes is not yet the thing for us, that person is not going to join. So you might say, so I might change the question and say, is slightly younger technology, closer to the bleeding edge, managed by a extremely experienced, talented, top talent type of person, better or worse than older, proven technology managed by a person who is not so good?
Well, that could cause what we're seeing now as the Great Resignation. We're recording this in 2021. People will see that and go like, oh, I'm out. I don't want that, like what you were saying.
Exactly. And then the more of people like that leave, the more important for you is to actually go with proven technology, because then you are less relying on capability of your own people and more relying on simply that being stable, that causing less problems, potentially doing less as well. But you're basically saying, I'm willing to do less in exchange for stability.
Now, let's take a real life example. Let's say you had picked Mesos instead of Kubernetes in 2015, 2016, because Mesos was pretty good. Well, let's say it is. Mesos was pretty good. It was a little bit older, a little more mature. Kubernetes was the new kid on the block. So you made the bet on Mesos in 2015, 2016, a very legitimate bet at that point in time. Agree or disagree?
Agree. It was a legitimate bet and it was a good bet.
Fast forward to 2021. Mesos has now been sent to the attic, Apache attic if you're unaware of that, and Kubernetes now rules the world. So in 2014, 15, 16, you made the decision to go with a proven technology and chose not to go with the newer technology. Again, I believe a correct, and you believe a correct decision. But looking back on it now 5-6 years, it was a horrible decision because now your platform is gone.
Now let me ask you this. At that time, was Mesos 7 years old?
That's a good question. Let me see. I don't know that it was 7 years old, but
let's put it this way. Mesos at that time was the edge, and Kubernetes just appeared. Mesos at that time was not something that absolutely every company was using and proved it to be working. It had relatively low adoption, higher than Kubernetes, but relatively low. The number of companies I knew at that time that used Mesos was very small, nowhere near where Kubernetes is today. So you were betting on more or less unproven technology that just happened to be more used than Kubernetes, but still not widely used.
It looks like it was, 2009, 2011. So it was still before Kubernetes, but I can't find an original release date.
Yeah.
So at that point, it wasn't 7, but let's split the difference and say 2010. And we were making our decision in, let's say, 2015. So 5 years. I'm going to take a 5-year over a 1 year, every day of the week, for something that I know that is going to be going to production.
Yes. Or no. Depends. It cannot be, and I think that that's where the mistake lies. It cannot be just because something is newer and something is older. You need to check what that 1-year-old thing is, right? Maybe a week with playing with it, or maybe a few days would tell you, okay, so this is not proven, excellent, this is new, excellent, but this is conceptually different. This brings benefits that are important enough for me to jump, right? It's not just, hey, this is older, this is newer. We're not. I hope that we're not evaluating things just based on the number of years it has.
Let's talk about the evaluation criteria. So the time of life has to be one of the factors. It doesn't have to be the primary factor, but it has to be a factor. I would say who is backing that project or product.
Exactly.
That's a big deal, because looking at Mesos, it was a research product out of UC Berkeley. Kubernetes, let's call it, was a research project out of Google, if I'm stating it correctly.
Yeah. I mean, not research. It was basically their Borg rewritten.
And that's an interesting angle too, because the product that you're looking at may not be greenfield. Well, let me rephrase that. It may be greenfield, but the thoughts behind it aren't greenfield. It's a reimagining of some other system.
You can legitimately say that based on what you said so far, Mesos is a better choice. And then fast forward a year and say, okay, or 2 years. Now, Red Hat is heavy contributor to Kubernetes. Azure jumped in heavily, and 57 other companies are involved in that. And then you have a situation where you have something that is not a year old anymore, but a couple of years old, with heavy backing from some important and some new players in the industry. And then the 7 years becomes irrelevant, because you can already say after 3 years, maybe Kubernetes being old and Mesos being 7 or more, saying, no, Kubernetes, now it's clear, Kubernetes is going somewhere. Now, not being 7 years old might not actually be important. Now, that does not mean that at that point in time, you should say, I'm going to move all my production to Kubernetes. And I think that that's where maybe many companies are making a mistake. When we say 7 years old, does that mean that I will wait until that something is 7 years old until I actually start using it? Not in production. In labs, once I start learning about it, once I spend maybe first year or two with it, because it will take you a year or two until that's something, until you're confident on the enterprise level that we are talking about, right? And then companies typically would say, big enterprises, the traditional ones, okay, I need this to be proven. Okay, excellent. But when it's proven, then you start actually playing with it. Then you start thinking about moving it into production. It takes you another couple of years until that is in production. So 7 years becomes 10 years until you're actually really using that something. Then it's too late. I mean, too late because it just took you too long.
Do you think when everyone else started working on Kubernetes, when Red Hat and Microsoft and everybody else just started helping out, quote unquote, did that invalidate the timeline because of the amount of people that, not just the amount of people, the amount of quality people working on that project?
That invalidated the timeline, definitely. But the real question is, why was the timeline invalidated, right? And the reason why it was invalidated is because companies, who many of whom know what they're doing, they did not use the timeline only. They evaluated, they played with it, they used it, and they said, okay, I see the potential in this. This is worth my investment. And that is the key thing. It's about you having the capability to explore things, to investigate things, and to see what is the potential worthwhile investing, which is not the same thing as worthwhile running in production. Right? You might be investing in something for a month and then put it in production, or for years and then put it in production. But you cannot judge something by only, is this mature enough? Is this 7 years old or whatever? Because that means that you're waiting for everybody else to adopt that something. Because when something is really good, when something has a potential, then those 7 years become irrelevant as a criteria. Those 7 years are more for other stuff, right? It's not so clear whether I should move from this SQL database to that SQL database. That's not often an important leap. But when there is a leap in industry that actually changes how industry operates, then 7 years might be too long for you to wait to jump on that train.
What if 7 years from your company's perspective is actually too short? What if you are in charge of, quote unquote, evaluating new software that we will be using in the company, but your company is so risk averse that they are unwilling to actually do anything. They just want it to come in and work day one. So they don't want to do evaluations. They don't want to do anything else. They just want to buy the package and let it run without evaluating, other than maybe a short evaluation, like short, like a week. Yeah. Is this going to work for me or not?
But isn't that kind of contradictory? And I know that is happening a lot, so I'm not judging whether that's reality or not. It is happening. But isn't that opposite of being risk averse? Saying, I'm going to wait until somebody tells me that it's okay to cross. It would be, imagine you putting a blindfold on a crossroad and then waiting until somebody tells you to cross. And you say, I'm not going to cross without somebody telling me that it's safe because I'm risk averse, even though I'm having a blindfold.
Yes. And during that time, you've heard semis coming by, and you've heard horses and carriages coming by, and you've heard petrol-driven automobiles going by. But now we've got electric cars. We have hovercraft. We have Sir Richard Branson going to space. Of course, that was pretty loud. Everything else around you changed, but you're still wearing the blindfold. You're going to be dead. Sorry.
It's okay to listen to advices from industry in general, which my interpretation of 7 years is actually I'm giving time for others to evaluate something and give me advice. And I think that that's okay. And I think that that's good. But that does not exclude you having your own opinions. And when you have your own opinions, then the age is not that important.
I agree. I think if you're stuck wearing a blindfold, that's one thing. That's a horrible thing, actually, if you're wearing a blindfold. If you're wearing blinders, not great, but it's okay. At least you can see straight ahead. But best is to not have anything obstructing your vision at all. And You have the capabilities of using your full faculties to do evaluations for yourself, whether it's actually you or your team doing those evaluations.
So is it, when you say companies that are risk averse, is it that, or is it that people in those companies being blame averse?
I believe it's the latter.
Because that's a real problem, I think. That, hey, if I choose this thing that exists for 4 years, so it's relatively new, close to the edge, and it doesn't work, I'm going to be blamed. So instead, I will wait until, I don't know, IBM sells it to us for $1 billion. And then it's not my decision anymore.
It's IBM's fault if it doesn't work.
Yeah. And I'm using IBM just as a name here, not trying to blame them.
We could go down a whole nother rabbit hole about blame and who puts up the gates and manages all that stuff. In fact, let's talk about that on the next episode, because that's a deep, dark hole that I think a lot of people end up in. It's playing the risk averse versus blame averse. And then all the crazy stuff that goes in place, like gates, to manage not risk aversion, but blame aversion. So, talking about today's, sort of wrapping up today's, how risk averse are you? Are you going to wait 7 years? Or are you going to actually use your full brain to make a decision and look at a system potentially that you're going to bring in holistically? Over in the Slack workspace, go over to episode 116. You'll see a thread there for that. You can put your comments in there about this episode.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. that helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at DevOpsParadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.